I've always had an affinity for Pokémon as a series. I'd call that a fun fact, but it's probably one of the most common gaming opinions out there. And like most people, though I've enjoyed most of the main games thoroughly, I've always thought the Pokémon franchise could be more than it was, that it wasn't quite as immersive or fulfilling as it should be, that there was something missing, though I could barely articulate what that something was. I wanted what the Mario RPGs were to their 2D and 3D platformers, a collection of games that dived deeper into the world and characters of the setting. It's no small exaggeration to say that I love the Mario universe as much as I do because of games like Mario and Luigi. This desire led me to the Pokémon series' spin-offs, and invariably the Mystery Dungeon games. What I saw was promising. A Pokémon game with a bigger emphasis on story? One where you could play as the Pokémon themselves? How could this not be good? As it turned out, the Mystery Dungeon games were very much an acquired taste. The first one I tried was Gates to Infinity, which I bounced off on 2 separate occasions, even though I'd made it about 2/3 of the way through. Must have gotten stuck. I distinctly remembered thinking the game was far more unforgiving than I had anticipated. Later, I would go on to try Explorers of Time, which I promptly put about 2 hours into before never touching it again. Not entirely sure why. I didn't even bother with Rescue Team. So it's safe to say my first few ventures with the series were not entirely successful. I was frustrated. I'd heard so many people sing this sub-series' praises, some even claiming that they were playing better than the main games. Admittedly, I was interested in the story, but it always felt like the gameplay was a slog I had to endure to enjoy the rest of it. The promise of infinite dungeons felt particularly hollow. None of the dungeons were all that unique to begin with. So what was I missing here? There had to be something. To find the answer to this question, I reluctantly gave the series one more try with the release of Super Mystery Dungeon at the end of 2015. And for some reason, this time was much different. Everything just clicked into place. I was immediately hooked by the story. The game was extremely charming, and I even found myself enjoying the dungeon crawling much more than before. I enjoyed Super Mystery Dungeon so much that I ended up 100%ing it in about a month's time, which if you played the game you'll know is no insignificant feat. But it wasn't the case that Super was just far and away better than the prior Mystery Dungeon games I'd played. I eventually returned to Gates for a 3rd time, this time beating it and thoroughly liking it. When Rescue Team DX came out in 2020, I snatched it up immediately and played through the entire thing. And no, I still haven't gotten back around to Explorers of Time. Regardless, it was pretty clear to me that I was now a bona fide advocate of Pokémon Mystery Dungeon. They were just clearly better than the main games to me at this point. So what exactly happened here? Why did Super seem to have such a profound impact on my enjoyment of the sub-series? As I'll attempt to argue over the course of this video, I think it's because the Mystery Dungeon games, and Super in particular, understands the core appeal of the series in a way even the main games fail to grasp. And this argument has only become more clear to me the more generations of Pokémon have come out over time. In some ways, Super Mystery Dungeon feels like the last and greatest Pokémon game ever released. Super begins on a curious note. In the previous Mystery Dungeon games, we're often shuffled into the main locale pretty quickly, whether that be joining a rescue team or building a Pokémon paradise. Little interest is paid to what our character's human-turned-Pokémon transformation means in the context of the world. To all of its denizens, we essentially get along like any other Pokémon. But in Super, things are a little more specific. We're not just any old human-turned-Pokémon, we're a kid. And children need to be taken care of by an adult. They need strict scheduling. They need to not be up past midnight. The game gets a lot of mileage out of this context. The first section of Super is not us going on extraordinary adventures, but us being adopted by a Nuzleaf and sent to school. In line with an average school day, this first arc in Serene Village lasts a whopping 7 hours. That's a pretty bold maneuver to spend a little less than half of the game's main story on something so definitely not advertised. And while most Pokémon games feature a young protagonist, they're certainly nowhere near as committed to this as Super is. Sure, you've always begun the adventure by saying goodbye to your mom, but by mid-game, you could age up the protagonist and little would change about how people respond to you or how the story progresses. Case in point, Scarlet and Violet also utilizes a school as the central focus in the game, but its application is relatively muted. It doesn't take long to rush you past the academy and into the open world, and after that, it's business as usual. That's what makes Super rather unique in this regard. More than a token gesture, the game seems genuinely interested in what it means to be a kid in this universe, and the story and characters are shaped around this critical aspect. The first 7 hours of Super Mystery Dungeon may just be its best, because it hits on something strangely compelling. Why is the Pokémon franchise so appealing in the first place? I mean, obviously, many of the creatures themselves are extremely appealing, but I think there's something more to it than that. It also has to do with the setting those appealing Pokémon are a part of. Fundamentally, the franchise takes place in a world not so dissimilar to ours. By and large, people still do the things we expect people would do in our world. It's just a slightly more utopian version. The technology of the times seems to be vaguely more futuristic without veering into full-blown science fiction. There doesn't seem to be any kind of homelessness epidemics or famine, world powers don't seem to be in agitation, and there's no current wars or conflicts to speak of. Pokémon, by and large, presents a utopia without radical change, one where the lives of most people look pretty similar to the lives of most people in the first world today, just with cool animals that also want to be your friend. This is the key to Pokémon's appeal. Branching off from a lot of other popular fantasy and science fiction settings, were someone to ask you whether you'd want to live in the world of Pokémon, you'd almost certainly say yes. It's just your life, but better. In many ways though, it feels like the franchise has lagged behind acknowledging this detail. The decision to focus so singly on Pokémon battling has scraped off the appealing mundanities of the setting. Were you to ask the average person what they would want to do if they lived in, say, Unova, instead of the United States, they would likely not respond by saying they would want to become a gym leader, or even a trainer. No, I suspect far more people would imagine themselves doing significantly less remarkable things. They would imagine waking up on a late Saturday morning next to their favorite Pokémon, taking a jog outside one of the region's idyllic-looking routes, or playing a game of basketball with their friends Typhlosion. The formula here is exactly as simple as I've already described it, an average life plus Pokémon in it. Ironically, the ultimate self-insert fantasy of the Pokémon universe is one in which the Pokémon themselves are marginalized compared to their presence in the games. This begins to explain why recent efforts like Pokémon Concierge are so positively received. It's a show that gets away from the bombast and excitement that typifies most of the franchise. The premise of Pokémon Concierge asks the audience to imagine what it would be like to spend a week at an island resort, but with Pokémon in it. That's appealing because it hits at precisely the kind of chill, slice-of-life attitude the franchise has spent decades so painfully neglecting. While spin-off titles tend to fill in some of the more niche gaps the main games forget, they too have a tendency to become single-minded. Pokémon Rangers Shadows of Almia also features a school setting in its opening hours, but it can't just be a regular school. It's specifically designated as a Ranger school, where students learn the art of furiously drawing circles around the Pokémon they want to catch. Even Pokémon Colosseum and Gale of Darkness can't escape the paradigmatic catching and battling that defines what it means to be a Pokémon game, though much of its locales do offer a more interesting, holistic view of the setting. Even in the spin-offs, the world still seems to revolve around that particular game's chosen gimmick. Mystery Dungeon, by this metric, seems to fare the best. While earlier games did tend to focus pretty singularly on joining a rescue team or guild, by the time of Gates, things seem to have loosened up a bit. Your partner doesn't even mention joining a team, they just want to build a house. And the residents of Post Town don't seem all that interested in these kinds of things either. Gates begins to show us a world beyond just teams and mystery dungeons. But Super Mystery Dungeon takes this and runs with it. Super, even more so than prior Mystery Dungeons, is one of the very few Pokémon games which actually seems to understand the assignment. In Super, the entire world doesn't revolve around the central mechanic that comprises the gameplay. Serene Village's school is not a school about how to be part of an expedition team, it's where the kids are supposed to learn their reading, writing, and arithmetic. Sure, we do spend a lot of time learning about mystery dungeons, but this is just an artifact of what the game is choosing to show us. These field trips are contextualized within the day as being only third period, not even close to the whole picture. Indeed, Super frequently presents the school and being in the Expedition Society in opposition to one another. With the exception of our partner, none of our classmates ever expresses an ambition to become part of an expedition team. In fact, our partner's enthusiasm about this is often a source of mockery and derision. Farfetch'd is concerned that our leaving to join the Expedition Society would interfere with our studies. Repeatedly, Super emphasizes that jaunting through mystery dungeons is not a thing most people in this world are obsessed with doing. Joining the Expedition Society is an occupation, not the occupation. It goes much further than this. Super Mystery Dungeon spends a great deal of time emphasizing the activities of the community at large. The first 7 hours of the game are concerned with little more than the day-to-day routine of our school lives. The conflicts are notably mundane. We deal with schoolyard bullies, we sneak out of our parents' house, we get chewed out for sneaking out of our parents' house. Even seemingly high-stakes issues like ghosts appearing near the school turn out to be little more than pranks gone wrong. The connection orb that Ampharos gives us is a fascinating little device. While its usage in the game is for Pokémon around the globe to post requests they want fulfilled, it almost acts as the Pokémon's precursor to social media, a method for Pokémon to communicate with each other over vast distances. It's even complete with random strangers who attack you for no discernible reason. The idea of a Pokémon Facebook or Skype is too amusing to pass up. As I've said before, Super Mystery Dungeon isn't the first game in the franchise to show a world outside of its central mechanics. But when it focuses for so long on the extremities, it taps into the same appeal that characterized Pokémon Concierge. It is a game where the Pokémon are both central to its appeal, yet almost completely incidental to everything around it. We could easily imagine a universe and story exactly like Super Mystery Dungeon, but completely removed of all the Pokémon. Make them all humans instead. It would lose a whole lot of what makes it charming, but it would still work. It is the difference between a game about Pokémon and a game featuring Pokémon. Make no mistake though, these preoccupations don't go away after leaving Serene Village. Lively Town is just as interested in its community. Every day when you first enter the town square, a bunch of Pokémon will be doing something new in the plaza. Some days it'll just be kids playing. Some days it'll be yoga. All the while a Doduo runs laps around the town each morning. Relentlessly adorable may be a better way to describe Super Mystery Dungeon. When Nuzleaf leaves for a trip, we're invited to spend the evening at our partner's house so we don't have to be alone. After getting caught sneaking out, Caracosta forces our partner to spend the day cleaning their room. The Expedition Society is concerned about employing children into their ranks. As such, they take extra care to make sure we'll be safe. Archon agrees to chaperone us on our first mission outside of the water continent. In order to cross the sea, Lapras recommends that Archon finance the seafare, on account of money not being something children should be overly concerned with. When Archon realizes he bought passes to the wrong location, he expresses remorse for ruining our first big trip. Later, on Fire Island Volcano, Ampharos pulls Buizel aside to ask him to keep us safe, on account of him being a water type. The game is just filled with scenes like this. I cannot emphasize enough how much personality a tiny bit of context like this adds to the game as a whole. It's the kind of detail that makes a world feel more alive and lived in. The same kind of small mundanity that makes the Pokémon universe more appealing. So we're already seeing why Super Mystery Dungeon might have clicked with me in ways previous Mystery Dungeon games did not. But of course, this isn't just any Mystery Dungeon, it's the self-appointed Super Mystery Dungeon. Is this title self-aggrandizement or legitimate self-reflection? I'm inclined to say it's the latter. Super Mystery Dungeon is clearly cognizant of the critiques of its predecessor. Gates to Infinity lacked many features people would come to expect from one of these entries. There was no personality quiz to determine which Pokémon you would transform into. Dungeons were simplified, from having fewer floors to the removal of the hunger stat. The potential roster of recruitable Pokémon went from all the currently available Pokémon to only 144, less than the number of Pokémon from the generation the game was supposed to be representing. Much like its final dungeon, the text speed in Gates was glacial. Super Mystery Dungeon deals with all of these. Not only is the quiz back, but you can easily choose between every starter from Gens 1 through 6, plus Pikachu and Riolu. Every single Pokémon is now available for recruitment. Text speed is now toggleable. Hunger is back. Actually exploring dungeons is perhaps the most engrossing it's ever been, thanks to the new Looplet and Amera mechanic that allows for more randomization and strategy within a dungeon. But Super also seems to be responding to Gates' story as well. Gates' partner character had a tendency to be extremely saccharine, to an almost exhausting degree. To be fair, this kind of character fits the overall narrative at hand, and Gates effectively wields the partner in contrast to the more cynical Pokemon around them. Still, Super seems acutely aware of how grating that kind of personality can become. The partner character in Super is arguably even more airheaded, an unabashed dreamer who crashes through life with eternal optimism. Though the game is ultimately sympathetic towards the partner's disposition, this is also the kind of game where the player expresses joy in how it's just so fun to mess with them. In one memorable scene, the partner straight up asks if you think they're irritating. Regardless of what you choose, the player will tell them that they are in fact irritating, to which the partner will respond by avoiding you because I wouldn't want to irritate you. Ironically, rather than irritating, scenes like this are refreshingly self-aware. This is exactly the kind of petty nonsense two kids would go angst over on the playground. The partner just asked if you were their best friend, and that's the kind of high-stakes question that only has one right answer. These summaries don't really do the game justice. Super doesn't just stop at considering prior games' issues, it goes above and beyond to an almost farcical degree. Super Mystery Dungeon is very obviously trying to live up to its namesake. Ever since Pokemon Gold and Silver, the idea of one game containing multiple regions has captured the minds of the fanbase. It's not hard to understand why. Even just getting 2 regions in one game seemed like an incredible bounty, so imagine if we could have more. This fantasy, as fantasies tend to, eventually ballooned to a ridiculous degree, morphing into the ultimate Pokemon experience. A single game that included all regions. The practicalities of such a project are too daunting to even consider, but Super Mystery Dungeon nevertheless attempts to tackle such an impossible project. While primarily taking place on one continent, Super eventually allows travel across the world, visiting other towns and dungeons to complete requests. Each continent is ostensibly based on one of the prior games, loose as that may be. You'll constantly run into minor Pokemon who make references to previous Mystery Dungeon games. Super is by far the most expansive game in the series, and in some small way contains a little bit of each game prior. While what constitutes a continent is far less than what including an entire region would entail, Super Mystery Dungeon might be the only game in the franchise to get as close as is realistically possible to the fabled all-region game. The most famous slogan over the course of the franchise was its first, "Gotta catch 'em all." This has remained the most well-known slogan, despite being largely abandoned over 2 decades ago. The slogan has become something of a lightning rod in recent years. Now that there are over 1,000 Pokemon in existence, the idea of catching them all has become decidedly less wieldy and increasingly more difficult to implement. As the expectation that you can have all your Pokemon in one game has vanished, many have lamented that catching them all will never really be possible again. Of course, this had always been a far trickier task for most, even before Generation 8, with many Pokemon locked behind various timed events or version exclusivities. Most people have never really had a chance to catch them all for a very long time. Which is what makes Super Mystery Dungeon all the more appealing. It contains a whopping 720 Pokemon, the total number of Pokemon from the first 6 generations. At the time, that meant literally every single Pokemon was in this game. More than that, to collect them all, you don't need to worry about missable events or peripheral accessories. And unlike previous Mystery Dungeons, recruiting them isn't a game of trial and error either. Each and every single Pokemon in Super has a dedicated method for recruitment, from fulfilling their dungeon requests to a simple chat in town. The effect is that no game in the franchise has made the task of collecting so many creatures this inviting and achievable before, or since. As with including every region, recruiting a Pokemon for a dungeon is significantly less grandiose than catching one in the main games, the kind of trade-off that makes a feat like this possible, yet it doesn't change what's been accomplished. Super Mystery Dungeon is a sort of platonic ideal for the franchise, one of the last games that was able to fulfill the promise laid out so many years ago. Super is also the game which introduced the fan-favorite Mega Evolution to the Mystery Dungeon formula, after its introduction earlier that generation. Evidently, the Mystery Dungeon series, unlike the rest of the franchise, saw no reason to get rid of it after the fact. While people begged for megas to return in subsequent main entries, the mechanic was actually added to the Rescue Team remake in 2020, long after the main series had completely lost interest. In hindsight, Super Mystery Dungeon feels like some kind of feverish fan service game, as if they somehow had the foresight to see exactly what Pokemon fans would be ranting about years from now. We can only wonder what the reception to a game like Super would be if it came out today. Just kidding, we definitely know what it would be. Of course, Super might be a little too grandiose for its own good. Super in many ways is an impressive game of contrasts. The first 7 hours may take place in a first grader's classroom, yes, but 7 hours later you're battling out of a hellish void dimension, and a few hours after that you're trekking up a giant tree floating in the stratosphere of a now non-rotating planet. It's the sort of wacky dynamism that gives the story a certain punch. Looking over the hill at Lively Town for the first time, it really does feel like you're entering a new status quo, which the game effectively follows up on by giving you access to the other continents. And once you return to Serene Village after the final battle, it really does feel like you've been on an epic quest. For as much as the Mystery Dungeon series is about exploring maze-like arenas, their stories tend to be similarly labyrinth. Mystery Dungeon games love their mysteries, and Super Mystery Dungeon has a pretty impressive grasp on the genre. The game effortlessly juggles at least half a dozen seemingly unrelated plotlines at the same time during our day-to-day expeditions. From the first few scenes in class at the beginning of the game, Shelmet mentions how hot it's been lately, a sentiment echoed by the ghosts that later haunt the school. The game cleverly disguises this as it being towards the start of summer, but as we later learn over a dozen hours later, the planet is in fact being pulled ever so slightly closer to the sun. The partner mentions they were bundled up in strange scarves which we later learn have the ability to make us spontaneously evolve. Nuzleaf indicates there being something strange atop Revelation Mountain in the village, but we never uncover what it is during our time there. The player character has a mysterious bout of amnesia at the start of the game, and must figure out why we were summoned here in the first place, and what the deal is with those Behemoth that attacked us. The partner can also read strange foot-shaped writing despite never having learned it. And of course, it's easy to forget that the central mystery of Super is a mysterious rash of incidents in which Pokemon turn to stone. That's a lot of mysteries. For someone who just finished talking about the Layton games, Super Mystery Dungeon might need one of those mystery tabs far more than Layton does. The game executes on these mysteries with confidence. The final twists in the game manage to tie everything together in a surprisingly coherent manner, if a little wordy at times. And the game sure loves its plot twists. I distinctly remember 14-year-old me playing the game for the first time, slamming my fist on the desk when it was revealed Esper was working with Nuzleaf. A good representation of the kind of power Super commands in its best moments. In fact, the game might be a little too into its plot twists. In the final farewell scene, Super Mystery Dungeon subverts expectations. Rather than a player vanishing, as is tradition, it is the partner who must leave, due to some extravagant time travel chicanery. It's a lot of information to process in the last few minutes of the game, and there's the sense this undermines what the scene is trying to achieve. Leaving such a twist until the literal last possible second means there's little time to unpack what is actually being said. So the focus becomes untangling the particulars of the plot thread instead of becoming emotionally invested in the scene that's playing out. Such is the case with a lot of the final act of Super Mystery Dungeon, which becomes over-encumbered enough by its plot that it fails to find the point. A lot happens in the last few hours, but the game never really finds an angle to suggest why they're happening in the first place. Indeed, much of what happens in the endgame of Super Mystery Dungeon feels like a retread of Gates to Infinity. That isn't a problem per se, but it quickly becomes obvious that Gates' rendition of the story is the vastly superior one. In both games, the main villain is a force of nature derived by the latent negativity from the Pokemon living in the world. Unlike in Super, however, Gates focuses pretty singularly on this point. In Gates, we're shown example after example of distrustful and angry Pokemon, people who actively reject and belittle the partner for daring to dream big in a cruel world. These are not just isolated incidents. When we see characters like Girder or Virizion, we understand them not just as mean-spirited, but as microcosms of a systemic cynicism that has taken root at the base of the world. Gates effectively makes the argument that hatred is not a static thing. Treat people badly in one area, and that negativity will ripple far beyond its intended target. In Gates, negativity has become a disease, one which characters like Virizion infect others with everywhere she goes. But Super never actually gets around to making this argument. Characters like Pancham or Crocodile never feel like more than exactly what they are, a schoolyard bully and a garden variety crook. There's never the sense they represent some greater problem endemic to this universe. On the contrary, most of the characters in Super Mystery Dungeon are surprisingly kind, and nasty characters like Nuzleaf and Yveltal are revealed to be brainwashed. Sure, they say dark matter was only able to control them because of the weakness already inside them, but critically the game never shows us this, so it may as well never have been the case. The consequence is that when dark matter shows up at the end of the game, spouting about how it was born from Pokemon's negativity, it's difficult to see how the rest of the game has been leading up to this point. And so the dynamism that energizes much of the latter story of Super veers too close to non sequitur, relying on its intricate plot mechanics and bombastic presentation to do the story's heavy lifting. This is not to suggest that the final act of Super Mystery Dungeon is unenjoyable or anything, there are still plenty of memorable moments, but it's disappointing that the game never comes to make a point even half as cogent as Gates did with characters like Kyurem. Still, Super Mystery Dungeon's story is adequately super. It's a story that manages to imbue the Pokemon world with a level of personality and intrigue that's rarely been achieved before, and as I've attempted to show, that's worth seeing all on its own. The Mystery Dungeon series suffers from a baffling kind of curse. For over 2 decades, it is a series that has been walking off the edge of a very long critical plank. Review sites giving Mystery Dungeon games a middling review score is about as surprising as Pokemon fans complaining about the latest generation of games, and the rationales are usually the same. The story was cute, but the gameplay was a nigh unbearable slog, a dull, tedious grind that makes you want to fall asleep at the wheel. I should understand this perspective. After all, it's the very same one I held back when I first played these games some 10 odd years ago. Over time, however, I've had one very key realization. I was wrong. The Mystery Dungeon gameplay isn't bad, or just okay, it's actually fantastic. It's addictively strategic in all the right ways, and unlike in other Pokemon games, you don't have to wait very long for that to happen. With Super, the sheer number of different requests and locales at your disposal means things can get very tense very quickly. Some of the most fun I had on this most recent playthrough was waiting until some of my highest level Pokemon were available for dungeoneering, stacking half a dozen requests in an extremely hard dungeon, and knocking them all out in a single day's expedition, racking up hundreds of expedition points as I went along. And that right there speaks to the appeal of the Mystery Dungeon series' gameplay. While many detractors talk about how the random generation makes the dungeons feel too similar, there's something about this explanation that misses the point. Exploring the dungeon is not really the interesting task in these games. It's not about the individual floors themselves. Instead, Mystery Dungeon is first and foremost a game about resource management. When I made the decision to do half a dozen requests in a very difficult dungeon, I had to properly prepare. Who are the Pokemon currently available to me? What kind of items should I bring with me? What about wands or orbs? How many floors do I need to traverse? Within the dungeon, if I'm running out of Reviver Seeds, should I start using wands to see where the stairs are and rush ahead? But if I've only got another 3 floors, maybe I should just wait and conserve them. These are the kinds of decisions you're required to make, even just a few short hours into the game. And it requires immensely more amount of thought than any mainline Pokemon game I've ever played, non-competitively I will add. It's why the decision to include an auto mode in Rescue Team DX wasn't quite the tell on the gameplay some people seem to think it was. It never removed the need to prepare adequately for a dungeon or use your items wisely. At its best, the gameplay in Super Mystery Dungeon makes you feel like a genius. The kind of strategy where you use the randomness of the dungeon to your advantage, like throwing a seed you find lying on the ground to confuse an enemy, or being alone in a dungeon where none of your moves affect the enemy, so you're forced to cast stay away wands on every enemy in the dungeon to make them move around, or finding a Confusion Gardamera and placing it on a Pokemon that knows Outrage, so you can use a move which attacks twice without suffering any consequences whatsoever. That's the kind of tactic that makes the Mystery Dungeon games so much fun. It's undeniable the Mystery Dungeon games can get a fair bit repetitive at times, but isn't this also the case with most mainline Pokemon games as well? The Mystery Dungeon curse has to give at some point. People can't really think Hyrule Warriors is less repetitive than Mystery Dungeon, can they? Okay, let's refocus. Super Mystery Dungeon is a one-of-a-kind event, the kind of alignment of stars that surely portends a miracle. We may never see a Pokemon game as successfully ambitious as this again. At the most basic level, it's an incredibly fun game that kindled excitement in a series I previously thought had none. And yet, for as gargantuan as Super Mystery Dungeon is, its greatest ambition arguably lies in its smallest moments. It's a game that advertises the world, yet has the audacity to lock it behind 7 hours of elementary schooler roleplay. Super Mystery Dungeon makes the Pokemon universe feel like a living, breathing place, one where people are allowed to have interests and hobbies that go beyond the franchise's rigidly prescribed hyperfixations. Super Mystery Dungeon imagines the kind of world where I can simply wake up, have a glass of water, and do absolutely nothing for the rest of the day. Plus, a Pikachu. Why wouldn't I want to live in the Pokemon world?